Hi, my name's Paula Roussel. My husband Glenn Roussel and I will be working together on our project today. We'll be teaching a class that's 4th through 6th grades, and it'll be in a Sunday school setting. Our lesson is going to be on Exodus, on the life of Moses, and it's based on the biographical exposition. So at the beginning of our lesson, I'll have a student come up, a volunteer, and I'll blindfold this student, and while he's blindfolded, I'll give him a number of things to try. First, it'll be a bite of asparagus, and after that, I'll have him taste a slice of lemon, and then I'll have him try a little chunk of raw potato. And after that, I'll give them a graham cracker. And when they're done tasting all of these things, I'll have them take the blindfold off and ask them if they're a little bit wary or suspicious by the end of what I was going to give them. And I would ask them if it's because they learned from their past experiences to be a little bit suspicious. And then I would relate this to our Bible story by saying that Moses, through his life, he learned from a lot of his past experiences, but the thing that he learned was that God would work through him and protect him if he was obedient. So we're going to start at the beginning. Moses was born in Egypt, and during the time that he was born, a lot of the baby boys were being killed. Pharaoh, the king, wanted to kill the baby Israelite boys because he was afraid that the Israelites were getting too strong, and he was afraid that when they grew up, they would take over and have all the power. So when Moses was born, his mother was really scared because she was afraid that Moses would be killed, and of course she didn't want her baby to be killed, so she hid him in a basket, and it was a waterproof basket that she made, and she put it in the river, and she had her daughter watch over her brother Moses while he was in this basket. And while Moses was in the river there, the Pharaoh's daughter saw this basket and had it brought over to her, and she saw that there was a baby inside of it, and she just loved Moses so much that she took him home and she adopted him and she raised him in the palace. And while he was in the palace, this is where a lot of Moses learned most of his things. He was raised as an Egyptian, and he learned to be an Egyptian. That's the life that he was raised with. So this is the first example that we see of God protecting Moses because of the plan that God had for Moses' life. He protected him from not being murdered, and he protected him by putting him in the palace where he had all this food and all this education. And we see quite a few years later, when he was growing up, that Moses was realizing a lot of the things that the Egyptians were doing to the Israelites wasn't right. They were beating the Israelites, and they were treating them, they were their slaves, so they were treating them as slaves, and they were making them work really hard, and it wasn't right. And Moses saw this one day. He saw an Egyptian beating an Israelite, and Moses got so mad that he killed the Egyptian. And this is the first big mess up we really see of Moses' life. And because Moses tried to take this into his own hands and do it his own way, he got into a lot of trouble, and he ended up having to run away so that he didn't get in trouble, maybe even get killed for what he did. So when he ran away to this land called Midian. And in Midian, it's like out in the desert, and he found this man named Jethro, and he lived with Jethro, and he helped by being a shepherd for their sheep, and he even ended up marrying Jethro's daughter. And while he was out in the desert here, he learned a lot of things about God, and he also learned a lot of things about God's people. And quite a few years, after he was there for a few years, one day he was out with the sheep in the desert and in the fields, and he saw this bush burning, and he went to check it out because he was afraid if the bush was burning that maybe it would spread and it could hurt his family or the flock of sheep. And when he got closer, he realized it wasn't a normal fire. And as he got even closer, God started talking to Moses, and Moses realized that it was God talking to him through this burning bush. And it was at this time that God was talking to him that Moses really started being revealed a lot of God's plans. God revealed the plans that he had for him to free his people, and he asked Moses to be obedient. So Moses was a little unsure at first, and he wasn't really trusting because he he was probably afraid, first of all, to go back to the palace, that he would get in trouble for years back when he killed this Egyptian. And he was also afraid that they wouldn't listen to him, maybe they'd make fun of him, and he didn't think he was really that good of a speaker. But finally he ended up trusting God because Moses was beginning to realize that he was doing things God's way is always better. So he goes back to the palace and he talks to the Pharaoh, and he tries to convince him to let the people go, to let the Israelites go. And one of the miracles that God did through Moses was to turn his staff into a serpent, and he threw his staff on the ground, it turned into a serpent, and then when he picked it back up, it turned back into a snake. And Pharaoh wasn't really impressed with this because he's seen his magicians do it, so he had his magicians come out and throw their staffs onto the ground as well. But Moses' serpent was stronger and bigger than their serpents. So his serpent ate theirs, and then he turned it back into a staff. And they'd never seen anything like this before, but Pharaoh was still really untrusting, and he refused to let God's people go. Next we see the 10 plagues, and God used these plagues to try to convince Pharaoh that he was who he was. So he had hail at one time, he had flies infesting the land, he had lice and frogs, he had lots of things happen. But through all these things, Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go, and he wouldn't listen to Moses. Finally, the last big plague that came was that darkness came over the city, and it killed all the firstborn sons of the people who didn't listen to God. But the Israelites' families were saved because they were obedient, and they listened to Moses when he told them that God said if they just paint some blood over their doorposts, that their families will be protected. And because of their obedience, their families were protected. But Pharaoh, because of his disobedience, lost his oldest son. His oldest son died in this plague. And this is what finally convinced him to let the Israelites go. And this is when they celebrated the Passover because of their freedom from slavery. And on their way, when they were freed from Egypt, Moses took the people out of Egypt, and Pharaoh changed his mind, and he had his armies chase after them. And Moses and his people were stuck in between the Dead Sea and the army, and they didn't know what to do. They got really scared. And God told Moses that he could part the Red Sea. So Moses obeyed God, and he parted the Red Sea, and the Israelites escaped safely. And God used a person who messed up so many times to free his people and to do these great miracles, even though he messed up. But Moses repented, and he changed his ways, and he was obedient, and he learned that God's way is always better, as opposed to before when he tried to take things into his own hands. That never worked out. So the first thing that we see from this lesson today of Moses' life is that God gives us second chances, and that we can learn from our mistakes, and that God uses those. And the second thing that we can use as an application to our life is that God rewards those who obey him. He works through them too, just like he worked through Moses. Moses obeyed God, and God used him. So if we obey God, God can use us. But if we harden our hearts, and if we disobey God, that we set ourselves up for sadness, just like Pharaoh lost his only son. And finally, our last point today is that God has a plan for every one of us. And just as Moses did, just as he had for Moses, it's up to us to choose to obey him. We have to make that decision ourselves. And when we do obey God, he can work through us. So this is what we have learned from the life of Moses today.